T.S. Eliot is the author of Old Possum's Guide to Practical Cats. That's a book of poems that will get transformed into one of the greatest Broadway musicals of all time. In fact, it might be the Broadway musical. It's so shaped what a Broadway musical is that it's changed the way the world thinks about musicals at all. But that wasn't the poetry that put T.S. Eliot on the map. In fact, T.S. Eliot himself would have smash hits on Broadway during his lifetime. But none of them had anything to do with the poems or cats or anything other than his own distant observations of his own failed marriage and his strange connection to some very conservative religious beliefs. And in the middle of all that, somehow, improbably, this guy has to write a children's book about cats. How did that happen? What made T.S. Eliot tick? Why did that result in a frightening move to the ugly right? And why was all that necessary for him to write Old Possum's Practical Cats? We'll curl up on the couch and find a nice, comfortable beam of sunlight as we share this saga in this episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries. I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production, go into a deep dive on the questions it raises and the answers it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I will never miss an opportunity to pursue any mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. Okay, thank you so much for listening. If you could drop me a quick note on the Buzzsprout page, you'll make me even happier if you drop a rating or review on any podcast player that you listen to. Apple is probably the most popular, but YouTube, whatever you got, I'd be happy for it. And I am doing what I can to provide some interesting content here. I'm hoping that it will engage you. And if you're hearing it and enjoying it, just do something to clap back and let me know that you're out there and I can hear it. Thank you so much for listening. The podcast is now past 20,000 downloads, which is a nice target to have hit. But we need to keep this going to make this sustainable in the long term. So thank you all so much for your help. And please do whatever else you can. All right. Here's what we learned about T.S. Eliot in the last episode. He was born in St. Louis, and he had a heck of an education. He went to prep schools at Smith and at Milton. He got 2 degrees from Harvard. One was a doctorate. He spent a year in France, and then a couple of years where he was supposed to be at Oxford, but he mostly hangs out at the London Library Reading Room. But he showed early signs of both humor and a desire to write and edit. While at Smith, he wrote his own newsletter with jokes and adventure stories. And during his time in college, he wrote a pornographic thing called King Bolo, which is pretty much gross male undergraduate humor. Think penis jokes as the more tasteful of the content. There are reviewers who have seen this stuff, and frankly, they seem embarrassed to have even read it. He goes back to England. He meets up with his fellow American, Ezra Pound, and with Pound promoting both him and his work, he proceeds to take the literary world by storm. He publishes one poem called The Love Song of Alfred J. Prufrock and another called The Wasteland. They are both successful, but The Wasteland becomes the archetypical example of modernist poetry, and Eliot becomes modernism's poster child. Professionally, he is really at an apex between about 1917 to 1925. He's writing good stuff. He's got a day job working as a banker for Lloyd's of London that he actually likes, and he's been able to spend his time editing journals, writing literary criticism, maybe fooling around with a play or two, and writing some more poetry. He's a central figure in Virginia Woolf's own publishing house. But he is a sexually anxious guy, and this shows up in his poetry. He's in a disastrous marriage with a woman named Vivian Haywood. She's, of course, changed her last name to Eliot. Both Eliot and Vivian have got significant health problems. According to a biographer named Russell Murphy, Vivian's ongoing health issues and their hateful marriage is taking a toll. Eliot isn't much more hardy than Vivian, and he has his own breakdowns. Here's a quote, Eliot took to wearing very pale green face powder in public. Virginia Woolf even reported seeing him wearing red lipstick, and among mutual friends, the poet Siegfried Sassoon took to calling him the Undertaker, end quote. Haven't we all worn weird green powder on our face and then red lipstick? The guy's not doing well. It's showing up in his mental state and his physical appearance, but he is thriving professionally. Now, according to another biographer named Peter Ackroyd, who starts his book with a quote by Eliot saying that Eliot had only been happy before and after his marriage to Vivian, Eliot is kind of incapable of empathy. Eliot's view of poetry is that it isn't about self-expression, but it's abstraction and objectivity and maybe coldness. That is, you don't write a love poem to say that you love someone. You fall in love. You abstract what that experience means. What is the nature of love? Then you write a dispassionate piece of wordsmithing about the abstraction in a highly objective way, dropping in the occasional Egyptian script or untranslated ancient Greek, which is, after all, how his poem, The Wasteland, is written. He's not a warm and cuddly guy. For Ackroyd, this is also part of his personality, this objectivity and abstracting. He can be totally polite to you, even joking and telling stories, but is always looking at you the way a scientist looks at a lab rat, studying you with an objective eye and observing your behavior to make some theoretical conclusion out of it. Some of his poetry is like that. He frequently slums it and walks around the poorer parts of town. And he has some poems called the Preludes that are about the lower society, but they are definitely in the tone that Ackroyd describes. They're very analytic. They're not super sympathetic. It's almost like he's really just trying to get an accurate description of somebody else's mental state, and he wants to describe what it is like to be so miserable and despondent, and maybe what it is about modern society that's made you feel that way. And this just becomes part of his personality. The point is that while he is thriving professionally, he is struggling personally. Burton Raffel, another biographer, says that Eliot always has a sense of humor, but that his critics have always treated his poems as if they're deadly serious. Of course, it is very possible both to have a sense of humor and be a bit of a jerk. That leaves an impression of Eliot as someone who is both a paragon of enormously serious, morbid, and depressing poetry, but also a guy who could write profane schoolboy jokes and King Bolo and enjoyed a good laugh. Famously, and as an expression of his very private and withdrawn personality, he did not want a biography to be written. He's quoted by Raffel as saying he did not, quote, wish my executors to facilitate or countenance the writing of any biography, end quote. He was withdrawn. Some used words like sardonic, but above all, he was intensely private. There's a part of Eliot that likes humor, but there's a much larger part of him that is appalled and terrified by the modern world, and he is constantly searching for meaning, and the haunted part of him is consuming most of his waking hours. Like I said, this guy's successful, but he is not happy. That's kind of the period between 1917 and roughly 1924. In 1925, he left Lloyd's to work for Faber and Guyer Publishers, which alienated Virginia Woolf and her publishing house. He kind of walked out on one publishing house to take a better offer at Faber and Guyer. Now he's not a banker. He's been able to quit Lloyd's. He's just an author. He's the most prominent figure in the literary modernist movement. Now, modernism is a new literary movement, and that makes Eliot a theoretical and literary radical. He's doing things differently from everybody else, and he's ruffling the feathers of those who think that everyone should basically copy Shakespeare and Lord Byron. This makes him a literary revolutionary, but that is only in literature. I mentioned earlier that at the end of World War I, a world had been gripped by centuries of ruling monarchies, but it was now seeing many new political possibilities out there. What was the world going to do now that royal monarchies were all but dead? Karl Marx, sitting in the same London reading room as Eliot, thought that socialism might be a decent answer to that. Two other possible options were, of course, fascism and what about democracy? Well, neither T.S. Eliot nor his patron and buddy Ezra Pound really launched his career, would choose democracy. Pound would go all the way off the deep end. But for all his literary rebellion, Eliot would be a political and a religious conservative. Here's a quote from the start of Ackroyd's 6th chapter, talking about a letter Eliot wrote to a friend named Richard Aldington in the same year that Wasteland was published. Quote, Eliot despised democracy, he explained to Aldington in the same letter, and he described in vivid terms the feeling of loathing and repugnance which the contemporary situation indicted in him, end quote. And Pound we'll get to later. But T.S. Eliot, right there at the dawn of World War I, is no fan of democracy. 10 years later, 1927, Eliot has a famous religious conversion and becomes a member of the Anglican Church. Others have described his beliefs as Anglico-Catholic. Either way, Eliot's flavor of Anglicism is old school Christianity, and it's a rejection of New Wave Unitarianism. That was the religion in which he was raised. We covered that briefly in the last episode. He also becomes a British citizen. He describes his political orientation as royalist, and there's a little bit of irony here. The very first Eliot is Andrew Eliot. He came to Boston by 1690. So the Eliot family is there and in Boston for the entirety of the American Revolution. They have roundly rejected British colonial rule. And here we are in 1927, where T.S. Eliot has now completely reversed course, has gone back across the Atlantic Ocean, and he has now taken on British citizenship. He likes structure. He likes discipline. Some say he's not mean-spirited. He just doesn't think that modern life can hold any real meaning, but ritual and religious structures can. Other people think he's just a jerk. Let's just say that when it comes to that time in history, others are embracing the Roaring 20s in Berlin. They're dancing their socks off at the Kit Kat Club and tearing off their clothes in wild sexual orgies. And Eliot is prayerfully offering his confessions to clerics in London. He's taken a turn to the conservative. In 1931, he's working for the publishing houses of Faber and Guyer, and here we get the first inkling that Eliot might write about cats. Faber, the publisher, made Eliot the godfather to his children, and according to Jai Tolentino, an award-winning New York staff writer, Eliot wrote an illustrated letter to his pre-kinder-age godson about his cat, which was named Jelliorum or Jelliorum. But anyway, that is the name of Eliot's cat. He is talking to his godson about his godson's cat, but goes off on his own cat named Jelliorum. But that's really just a blip. That's 1931. It's just a letter to his godson. It's not really central to his writing. Then in 1932 and 1933, he hits another turning point. He's going on a reasonably lucrative tour of America. He's being paid to lecture. And as he leaves England, he gives his lawyers instructions to divorce Vivian in his absence. You know, Vivian has been sick a lot. Both Vivian and T.S. Eliot have been in and out of asylums, but it's hitting Vivian harder than it's hitting him. She is not a well woman, and all the biographers recognize this as kind of a dick move. Murphy says he divorced her, quote, like a thief in the night, end quote. He's not a total jerk about all of it. Although their early years were rocky, he was very attentive to Vivian and especially her medical needs. The two were kind of devoted to each other, and she still believed in him for quite a long time. Murphy would report that he was distraught at her death, which would not come till 1947. But in 1932 and 1933, he's divorcing his spouse, in absentia, and that is not an act of courage. He wasn't the best at personal relationships. This was a pretty low point, even for him. For Eliot's part, it ends a very unhappy burden, and he spends his time on the tour hanging out with an old sweetheart named Emily Hale. For Vivian's part, she just keeps acting like they're still married. This could be part of her ongoing mental illness or her way of objecting to what's happening between the two of them. But her bad physical and mental health have only gotten worse, and she spends most of the rest of her life in and out of institutions, and mostly in them tended to by her family. Consider this really creepy description of their last meeting. This comes from Louis Menand, who I referred to as a New Yorker writer. That's true. I think he's also a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. So let's give Louis his due. Here's the quote. In 1935, Vivian managed to track her husband down at a book fair. So this is a couple years after he's divorced her, where she learned that he was scheduled to give a talk. She wore her fascist uniform and carried in her arms 3 of Eliot's books and their terrier, Polly. As the audience was getting seated, she turned and saw Eliot was right behind her. On his way to the lectern, she recorded that moment in her diary. These are the quotes in the diary. I turned a face to him of such joy that no one in that crowd could have had one moment's doubt. I just said, "Oh, Tom." And he seized my hand and said, "How do you do?" in quite a loud voice. He walked straight onto the platform and then gave a most remarkably clever, well thought out lecture. I stood the whole time holding Polly up high in my arms. Polly was very excited and wild. I kept my eyes on Tom's face the whole time, and I kept nodding my head at him and making encouraging signs. He looked a little older, more mature and smart, much thinner and not well or robust or rumbustious at all. No sign of a woman's care about him. No cozy evenings with dogs and gramophones, I should say. That ends her diary quote. Here continues the quote from Menand. After the lecture, she went on stage and stood next to him while he signed copies of his books. I said quietly, "Will you come back with me?" "I cannot talk to you now," Eliot replied. He signed the books she had brought with her, and then he left. She never saw him again. End quote. Yeah, that is a sad end to an unhappy marriage. She is still clearly clinging to the notion that they're married, and he is clearly done with it. Also, having your ex-spouse show up at a reading with your dog that she's holding high in the air might be enough to make you write a book about cats, which is what he does. At the same time this depressing incident has happened, he starts writing about cats. This time, he writes to an adult friend named Polly Tandy, explaining that there are 4 types of cats, which he calls practical, porpentine, big bravo, and Gumby. This is still in private correspondence, but this is clearly a guy who thinks a lot about cats. He has a lot of cats, and he does give them names like the aforementioned Jellyorum, but also George, Pushdragon, Pettypaws, and Whiskus. On the dog, cat, pet spectrum, he is all in on cats. Still, however, as private correspondence. In 1934, he writes his first play. It's called The Rock, without a single reference to Dwayne Johnson, which I guess we should forgive because Dwayne Johnson hadn't been born yet, but you would think that modern editors would have inserted it, whatever. The play is about building a church. It sold 1,500 tickets, which is pretty respectable, and most importantly, it marked Eliot's entrance into performance. Instead of just literature, he really hadn't done anything there since he was a grad student at Harvard. In 1935, he has another play produced. This one is called Murder in the Cathedral. You'll notice those are both kind of religiously oriented plays. In 1936, he now writes to Polly Tandy's daughter a complete poem about a Gumby cat and signs it, "Your Faithful Possum." The publishing house about that time starts teasing that their literary celebrity, TS Eliot, is going to release a book about cat poems. They are not lying. In 1939, he releases a book under the title Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. This is not a big deal. It warrants 1/2 of a sentence in the biographical section of Murphy's book. Douglas Adams would have called it mostly harmless. In Murphy's longer treatment, because remember, Murphy's the guy who writes a biography at the start of his book, and then he's got like 600 plus pages of stuff where he gives longer treatment to every single one of Eliot's works. Cats gets all of 2.5 pages. Peter Ackroyd gives it 2 paragraphs in his 396-page biography. Raphael, another biography, says, quote, "The 14 nonsense poems collected in the little volume are pleasant, inoffensive, and unremarkable." End quote. Raphael then draws a direct line between King Bolo and cats. Both Raphael and Ackroyd make some fleeting nods to what they think the book might mean, but the general feeling overall is that the book shows that Eliot did have a sense of humor, or the other reaction is that it doesn't mean anything at all. They're just silly poems. As proof that Eliot did have a sense of humor, however, Murphy points out that Eliot had a picture of Groucho Marx in his office, so amidst the gloomy backdrop of the wasteland, this is just kind of a fun poem. Maybe this is the happy side of T.S. Eliot burgeoning its way out. And there's some fun tidbits. Ackroyd says that the man in white spats is John Hayward, who we'll meet in a second. McCavity, the cat, is derived from Moriarty of Sherlock Holmes fame, and Eliot himself drew the cover illustration. So there's, some fun little Easter eggs hidden in that book. And there are other things to discuss, which Tolentino does at length. In the name Old Possum, it was given to Eliot by Ezra Pound, and it comes from the character of the Uncle Remus book. There's a character in Uncle Remus called Old Possum. Ezra Pound uses that nickname to describe T.S. Eliot. Now, that book, Uncle Remus, is the book that Disney based their movie The Song of the South on, and has such flagrant and offensive stereotypes of black culture that Disney has done all they can to remove it from their catalog. I guess you can't make the movie not exist, but they're not showing it anymore. Pound and Eliot however, used the dialect in the letters that they exchanged in the same way that two white frat boys might communicate using all rap lyrics in a sarcastic way to try to prove that they were cool, but mostly to mock the language of people of color. In these discussions or these letters, they drop a whole bunch of N-bombs. It has not aged well and was probably not even okay at the time, but it's sort of kind of the casual racism you might expect of privileged white people at the time. At least Eliot was probably not a member of the KKK and doing active things to suppress black people, but they definitely were engaged in language that made it clear that they thought that black people were not worthy of respect. So Tolentino finds this, puts a strain of racism on cats from the very start. Tolentino cites Michael North and writes, quote, Eliot's fondness for doggerel and light verse in particular was intertwined with the racist notion of blackness as a gateway to cultural disruption and linguistic play. Old Possum's book, Practical Cats, required an authorial persona that facilitated outright foolishness for Eliot, and though explicit racism largely vanishes within the actual text, it does jump out occasionally. Most of all in Growl Tiger's Last Stand, in which Eliot, describing Growl Tiger, a grizzly pirate cat, writes, but most to cats of foreign race, his hatred had been vowed. To cats of foreign name and race, no quarter was allowed. The chinks swarm Growl Tiger his vessel, and the lady cat screeches, badly skeered. End quote. All right, that is all cringy. There's some indication that Eliot was fond of the old black minstrel shows that he used to see in St. Louis when he was a kid. But if Eliot isn't openly racist, Ezra Pound sure was, and there is an uncomfortable influence on that. And now I guess is as good a time as any to talk about Eliot's anti-Semitic and racist views. Murphy dedicates 3 pages to the topic and writes, quote, there are definitely elements of anti-Semitism in Eliot's poetry and prose, end quote. I am not going to give detail to those because they are uncomfortable for me to repeat, among other things, but there's no doubt that they're in the poems openly and unambiguously. Murphy cites a 1995 study by an Anthony Julius, which is titled TS Eliot, Anti-Semitism and Literary Form, which concludes that the expressions that can be expressed as anti-Semitic in Eliot's poetry and in his prose certainly legitimize anti-Semitism, end quote. And there are many other articles that point out that attempts to be an apologist for the anti-Semitism in Eliot's work don't really pan out. The dude was anti-Semitic and not really in an excusable way. And this is the dark side of Eliot's conservatism. And Murphy links his malicious treatment of Jewish people to the excesses of conservative Christian dogma. Let's not forget that the Catholic Church created the first ghetto for the Jews. It persecuted them during the Passion Plays. It tortured Jews during the Inquisition. And it probably condoned much of what Hitler was doing in World War II, or turned a blind eye, or definitely did not try to rally Catholics to stop things like eugenics, which you'd think the church would be opposed to. This has been documented elsewhere. If you enter Christian religion and move too far to the right, you can find yourself in anti-Semitism pretty quickly. And Eliot was always walking on or over that line. How much this creeps into the musical, I will take up later. But one thing that Eliot can never escape is his association with Ezra Pound, and their race-baiting jokes are right there in the title of Cats. If you love the musical, I don't want to take anything away from you. But if you're not ready to fully separate the artist from the art, and I am not, there are just parts of T.S. Eliot that are disturbing. So turning the page a bit, at this time, Eliot is publishing a bunch of other poetry as well. It's nothing as serious or famous as Perf-Rock or The Wasteland, although if you're into literature, there are definitely people who are that love some of his poems from that time. But at this point, everything that he's publishing is a big deal because he's T.S. Eliot. It's like catching Steven Spielberg's next movie or the next movie with Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson in it. His poems are important, and he is important. During most of World War II, he's writing about Catholicism and culture, and in 1946, he's written some essays on Christianity and culture, and he delivers 3 of them in a radio address to the German people in German. He is nothing if not smart, and he spent some earlier time in Germany. He'd studied when he was younger, and he was fluent. In 1945, he moved back to London and got an apartment with John Hayward, who was a literary figure of note on his own, and they lived together for 11 years. Hayward, a literary critic. He eventually took charge of Eliot's literary estate, and he also had muscular dystrophy. For those who think that Eliot was homosexual, this relationship adds more to fuel the fire. Hayward himself described himself as the least homosexual person in London, which suggests there were rumors swirling, but, there's no direct evidence that there was a homosexual relationship there. That article by Lewis Menard reviewed Eliot's sexuality. That's not super relevant to what we're doing here, but I'll just say that if you thought that Eliot was repressing something, there's a lot of evidence on your side. If you think you know what that thing that he was repressing was, well, then you are on much shakier ground. You might as well, for example, be writing speculative ghost stories based on fragments of half-confirmed facts. I'm not going to do that for 2 more episodes, but I guess what I will say is that when we get to Cats the Musical, there's definitely something about sexuality that's going on there. And what is important to see in the life of T.S. Eliot to understand that, I think, is that T.S. Eliot had some kind of sexual repression going on, although it is equally true that nobody really knew what exactly the nature of that was. Maybe he was just, as his earlier poems suggest, aware of sexuality, aware of his attraction, but racked with guilt about it because of his religion, so he couldn't really act on it. Then his marriage with Vivian probably didn't make any of that any better. He might or may not have had some intimate male friends. There might have been repressed homosexuality. Some people think there was. Others think there was not, but there's not a ton of definitive proof. Either way, what is clear is that he was repressing something. The end of that roommate-ship was not happy. Eventually, Eliot would remarry and shift his literary estate duties to his new wife. Some would liken Eliot's leaving Hayward to the way that he left Vivian. It was apparently unhappy, but there's one more footnote on that relationship. According to Raphael, John Hayward is the man in white spats who, of course, appears in the book and in the musical. Okay, so that's what T.S. Eliot is getting onto and getting up to in London. And meanwhile, Ezra Pound is now completely melting down. I'm just going to crib the Wikipedia entry here because a few bare facts are astonishing enough. Now, during World War II, he openly expressed support for Hitler and Mussolini. He actually met Mussolini, and the two of them traded a few jokes about Jews. He moved to Italy and recorded hundreds of paid radio propaganda broadcasts for the fascist state. He blamed, probably correctly, World War I on finance capitalism, and he blamed, certainly incorrectly, all of that on the Jews. He supported eugenics and the Holocaust in Italy, and he encouraged U.S. GIs to throw down their arms and surrender. When Italy lost the war, the Italian resistance turned him over to the U.S. government, who put him in a military detention camp, which included 3 weeks in an outdoor steel cage. He was indicted for treason, ruled mentally unfit to stand trial, and then locked up at a psychiatric hospital called St. Elizabeth's in Washington, D.C. for 12 years, earning a diagnosis well-earned as a narcissist and as a psychopath, although the Wikipedia entry also says, but other than that, he was totally sane. Sure, other than those two things, he was probably fine. Here's a direct quote from the Wikipedia entry, quote, Pound's anti-Semitism can be traced to at least 1910, when he wrote Patria Mia in essays for a publication called The New Age, that's italicized. The Jew alone has retained his detestable qualities despite climatic conditions. That's the quote from Pound. The sentence was removed from the 1950 edition. In 1922, he apparently disliked that so many Jews were contributing to a journal called The Dial. And in 1939, when he read his poetry at Harvard, he was said to have included anti-Semitic poems in the program because he believed they were Jews' audience. End quote. He did not quite get the end he deserved. I'm going to again quote directly from the Wikipedia entry, quote, well, in custody in Italy, Pound began work on sections of the cantos, which were published in the Pisan cantos, Pisan, P-I-S-A-N, 1948, for which he was awarded the Bellengian Prize for Poetry in 1949 by the Library of Congress, causing enormous controversy. After a campaign by his fellow writers, he was released from St. Elizabeth's in 1958 and returned to Italy, where he posed for the press, giving a fascist salute and called the United States, quote, an insane asylum, end quote. He finally died in 1972. So, great all-around guy who maybe is the poster child for being too smart for your own good. There is more, even more than that. that could be said about Ezra Pound. But we're here to talk about T.S. Eliot. Let's just say that at this point, Pound was not a stabilizing influence. And if there is racism and anti-Semitism in the work of Eliot, which, remember, Pound had heavily edited, Ezra Pound was not going to be the guy to take it out. There is fascism and unhappiness right around Ezra Pound, which is undoubtedly affecting T.S. Eliot. Then in 1947, Vivian finally dies. As mentioned earlier, Eliot is reported to be distraught. He hasn't seen her since that 1935 book signing and the family dog incident. But it is a tortured relationship through and through, and her passing affects him. That's a major part of his life that is over, and he might be romantically involved with other people, but I could not find evidence of a stable romantic relationship too much before she dies. In 1948, Eliot wins the Nobel Prize for Literature. So if he wasn't on the map before, he sure is now. And in 1954, he publishes a play that is called The Cocktail Party, which, get this, is about a failed marriage gone wrong because both parties were too self-centered, among other things. It's a huge hit in New York. Now, he's already a celebrity. He's already got a Nobel Prize for Literature. He's the poster child for modernity and modernist poetry. But there's still a question of whether this guy who has gone British can write something for an American audience, and the success in New York steals that deal. He then writes a show called The Confidential Clerk, which is a follow-up and also a success. Since his separation from John Hayward, he's had a literary secretary named Valerie Fletcher, and in 1957, she has served in that role for 8 years. She and Eliot get married, she being 40 years his junior. You know, if you wanted to extend your legacy, a good way to do it would be to marry somebody 40 years younger than you, who's also the curator of your literary estate. But he is happy now, as the quote at the beginning of one of his biographies had noted. He was only happy before he married Vivian, and after he married Valerie, he's now happier. His health improves a little bit, and his poetry gets a little happy, or at least a little happier. His last play is called The Elder Statesman, and it is a flop. In 1963, the dissertation that he sent to Harvard in 1916 is finally commercially published. There's a couple copies of the dissertation, of course, in the Harvard Library, but it's not generally available. And in 1964, he dies. Now, if you yourself hold a PhD, you probably appreciate the irony of feeling like giving up on life after your dissertation is completed and finally published. What else are you going to do that's going to top that? It probably also had something to do with the very strong French cigarettes that he had smoked all of his life since he had been in France for that year, but he passes away in 1964. His ashes are placed in East Coker, which is where 7 generations back, his great-great-grandfather, the Power of 7, Andrew Eliot, had emigrated from. There's a plaque to him in Westminster. He had reclaimed England, and England had reclaimed him. The Midwesterner, who was born in St. Louis and loved structure and order, died more of an Englishman than an American. So we have hit a save point. That is the basic life of T.S. Eliot. He had Boston connections. He moved to England. He had a totally toxic first marriage. He was a literary celebrity and a key figure in the modernist movement. He had a tortured personality. He was deeply private and very sexually non-expressive. He was not a happy guy. And the people who describe him, including himself, keep using the word demons. He's literarily radical, and politically he's conservative. His politics turn downright ugly. And there are legitimate and not really contested elements of racism and anti-Semitism in his life and in his poetry. He owes much of his career to Ezra Pound, and that guy sucks. And right in the middle of all that, he writes a delightful children's book about cats. All right, well, we still need to get from here to the Broadway production. That is going to be a much less depressing tour than we have just taken. And after that lies our accounting of demons, of T.S. Eliot, and of the occult. How exactly do you take a bunch of nonsense children's poems, roll with that total lack of a plot, turn it into a runaway Broadway musical hit? How do you take the work of the most sexually repressed guy in England and turn it into an open sexuality of performance that swoons audiences? In the words of Colton Krause, who is better known as Tumble Brutus, a character from the musical, quote, "I think you either love it or you hate it. There really is no in between. I've never heard anybody go, I kind of like cats," end quote. Do you love it or do you hate it? We'll have much more for you to embrace or despise on the next episode of Theater, History, and Mystery.